a lot of people don't realize this, but nuclear power plants, even though they generate electrical power, they most often depend on external electrical power to run their cooling systems. They need independent power sources from the power they generate. And that's because simply you don't want to have a feedback loop. You don't want to depend on your own electrical generation to power your own cooling systems. So it's very important to have that external independent AC power from the grid. And that's why it's those plants are designed that way, but that also creates this vulnerability, because if you have a loss of offsite power, which is not an uncommon occurrence, it can be caused by a wide range of natural disasters, um, then the plant has to go on backup diesel generator systems. And Zaporizhia is well equipped um, for that scenario. In contrast to the US, where the NRC only requires 2 independent emergency diesel generators per reactor, Zaporizhia actually has 3, in addition to 2 common or 2 additional generators that can be used for different units. So there are a total of 20 emergency diesel generators on the site for 6 reactors, and only 1 is really needed to maintain shutdown cooling for any of the reactors. So they have a lot of resiliency there. But if all of the generators fail for whatever reason, then you can have a station blackout. Um, and um, and again, even the units are not necessarily fully interconnected. So if you have a loss of power or a station blackout at one unit, it may, depending on the alignment of the electrical systems, be able to draw in power from an adjacent unit, but it may not be. So it could happen individually in any one of these units if if the power system can't be realigned for whatever reason. And if all the generators fail, um, all you have is DC battery power, which is not sufficient to run the pumps. But it is needed to maintain instrumentation controls and lighting. And in Western style or Western reactors, they have systems which can continue to provide cooling in the absence of electrical power because they're driven by their own steam. And this is actually something that's not present at the VVRs. So they don't have that backup. So if they lose all electrical power, even if they have battery power, it's not going to be good enough to forestall a core melt for very long. And you could also damage DC power and the electrical distribution system. So even if your generators are in working order, you might not be able to use them to deliver the power where they're needed. And that is what occurred at the Fukushima during the Fukushima disaster in 2011 Japan. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can just scroll down. Sorry. Yeah. So so quickly, Fukushima was a station blackout, a prolonged loss of all AC power, and that's because it was first initiated by a massive earthquake, which took out the offsite power lines to the plant. All the backup diesel generators started, but the tsunami that was generated flooded the site less than an hour later, and that caused a massive power failure, disabling all the electrical systems, including the backup diesel generators, most of the batteries. You can keep scrolling. I think we're another bullet. Right. So they had a station blackout because of this common mode failure, the flood that took out almost every diesel generator. And that is what led to the crisis. Next slide, please. So, it doesn't matter how many redundant backup systems you have. If something happens that disables all of them at once, then you are in trouble. And there are scenarios where that could occur at Zaporizhia. For instance, if they lost offsite power for a long period of time, those diesel generators are going to run out of fuel. And the site was stocking about 10 days worth of fuel. But also, you can't expect the backup diesel generators to run continuously and without failure for longer periods of time than that. In fact, they're only rated for 250 hours. So beyond that, you can't expect they're going to continue to operate without being able to maintain them. You could also take out the ultimate heat sink, and those diesel generators, in order to function, they generate heat of their own. And you have to keep the temperature in the diesel generator hall below a certain temperature so you don't destroy the diesel generators. That means that heat has to be taken away from the site and deposited in the environment. And so if that ultimate heat sink is disabled, you could take out all the diesel generators at once. And then, of course, damage to electrical distribution systems if you have a fire in the switch yard leading to electrical faults. Those could propagate through the entire electrical system and potentially lead to a large-scale power a failure to deliver power. So there are certainly ways in which this could happen, even with the redundancy that's built into the site. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if a nuclear reactor loses the ability to cool the fuel, uh, depending on the design and the circumstances, within a few hours, typically you're going to have fuel exposed. Uh, the water level in the core is going to decrease below the top of the fuel, and once they're exposed once there's no water, uh, then the steam uh, is not sufficient to remove heat um, to keep the fuel from overheating, and you're going to have a core melt. In addition, as the fuel melts, the cladding, which is a zirconium alloy, will react with steam to generate hydrogen gas, leading to the potential for hydrogen explosions, as was also seen at Fukushima. And then the containment. And so the progress of this accident is that the fuel will melt, it will slump down to the floor of the steel reactor vessel, and it will actually eat through the floor of the reactor vessel and drop to the containment floor. In that case, the containment is the only thing that's preventing a release of radiation to the environment. But containment failure could occur gradually as pressure builds up over time or catastrophically. Next slide, please. You can scroll down through these. So separately, the spent fuel pools also require cooling. If spent fuel becomes exposed, uh, typically that would occur in air. Um, and I actually don't know in Zaporizhia where the spent fuel pools are right there next to the reactor vessel, and it's this enclosed system. I don't know, but whether it would be steam or air that they would be exposed to, but generally, um, if the fuel is exposed to air, it undergoes oxidation processes that could then lead to a zirconium fire. So the zirconium itself could ignite and propagate through the entire spent fuel pool and lead to a massive release of radioactivity from the pool. Next slide. And this is what mock spent fuel looks like after it's undergone a self-generated zirconium fire. Next slide, please. So at a VVR 1000, there have been quite a few analyses of how fast it could progress if you lose all alternating current power to a core melt. So this is one study that was done in Germany, and there's a lot of numbers here, but the bottom line is that once the initiating event occurs, you're going to start to have fuel damage within a few hours. And the lower head of the vessel, that is that melt through I was talking about, um, would happen in less than 10 hours. So, so there's in that situation, there's a pretty short window for people to intervene to try to get cooling restored before the core starts to melt. Once you start having melting, then it becomes much harder to arrest that before you lead to this situation of vessel breach.